Hello and welcome to our professional webinar this month of July. It's nice to have you with us. Today we have a very special guest who is Dr. Kristen Welly. She has a PhD. She's a professor and vice chair for research in the departments of neurosurgery, and physiology and biophysics. She works at the University of Colorado at the Anschutz Medical Center. And the topic for today is neurotechnology for neuronal repair. So, welcome, Dr. Welly. It's lovely to have you here.
Thank you so much. It's my pleasure to be here. I'm really excited to have this conversation.
Well, I'm really excited to hear what you have to say, as I'm sure our listeners are too. First we need to talk about our descriptions of ourselves. So I am a middle-aged, lightly pigmented, brown-haired woman. I have a white blouse on today because you'll notice the new background. And I have on a pink necklace, which has flowers on it because I thought maybe we needed some nice sunny weather for a change instead of all that rain that our tornado friends have been having, or hurricane friends. And Dr. Welly, would you like to describe yourself?
Sure. I am also a middle-aged woman with light skin and lighter colored hair that's long, a little bit below my shoulders, and I'm wearing a blue top and just a little small necklace. Yeah. Did I miss
Oh,
anything?
okay. Well, first of all, I have to say, if you are middle-aged, then I have to up mine. So I don't know about that, Dr. Welly. But okay, we've got that on. So let me ask you, what inspired your interest into technology, recovery, the scientific side of what's going on in our world in neurological uh, injury and trauma?
Yeah, so I've always been interested in the brain and the mind and sort of, how our brain works and how we use our brain to solve problems in the world. In fact, when I found a journal from when I was in fifth grade, and there was some prompts in the journal, and it asked, what do you want to learn about or study when you get older? And I said, like, I would like to study the brain. So it's been a longstanding interest. But I did my undergraduate degree and then my subsequent graduate studies in the study of neuroscience. But I was really focused on just understanding how the brain works. So, kind of a basic science perspective on how do the neurons within the brain communicate with each other. But as I was finishing my PhD, I really started to become more interested in how can we as humans living in this world today interact with our nervous systems in ways that can help drive repair and recovery. And so after I finished my PhD, I took a job at a government agency, so a little bit of a non-traditional path for an academic scientist. Went to a government agency, the Food and Drug Administration, in the Center for Devices and Radiological Health, and that's the agency that controls how medical devices and drugs come onto the market to treat patients. And I had the opportunity there to work on neurotechnology for the first time. And so I ran a research group there looking at brain computer interface technology, which is a type of technology that I'll mention today when I get into my slides in a minute. And so that was my first exposure to really understanding the benefit and the possibility of neurotechnology and how it can be used to work with our nervous system to help to restore capability. And one of the cool things about being at the FDA is I got to see a lot of different types of neurotechnology and devices that were on the market. And so it really gave me a big picture view of what's out there and what's possible.
Well, I'm just thinking that must have been a thrilling opportunity
Yeah, it
to
was.
study at such a level and to work at such a level with everything that's going on and hearing about all these exciting things. So now I understand that you are have started an FDA collaboration community for implantable brain computer interface devices. So could you tell us about that? Because that is a new thing that we're hearing about. And I know a lot of our listeners are always asking about brain computer interfaces. I mean, it's the hot topic right now.
Right.
So could you tell us all about that? Because this is a wonderful, and I know it's in collaboration, I have to say, with the Reeve Foundation.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. So this is, I think, a good opportunity maybe to segue into some of the materials that I prepared for today, because I really do want to both give everyone here on the call today the opportunity to learn a little bit more about neurotechnology, including brain-computer interface devices, and also other sort of neural stimulation devices. And then with that background knowledge, then to understand why this new IBCI collaborative community is so important. But I'll start by saying that the goal of the IBCI collaborative community is to bring together the FDA, which regulates these technologies, so all the reviewers at the FDA, advocacy groups and associations like the Christopher and Dana Reeve Foundation, and many others, and then industry. So all of the companies that are out there actually developing and trying to commercialize these technologies, along with the scientists, with users, with clinicians, and bring everyone together into a space where we can have conversations about how to move the whole technology forward in a way that makes sense for all the stakeholders. And so it's a really neat and unique opportunity to do that in a very systematic way. And so I'll describe a little bit more about the IBC at the end, but let me, if it's okay with you, Linda, would it be all right if
Absolutely.
I kind of segue into some of the materials? Okay. All
I
right.
think
So
that
let
would
me
be
just,
perfect.
okay, awesome. So let me just share, and I don't have an overwhelming number of slides. I just want to give a little bit of background into what neurotechnology is, what exists, and a little bit on how it works. So I have a couple of slides, and we'll share these. And here we go. Sorry, my computer's thinking about sharing this and getting there. Let's see. Okay. Are you looking at the correct view or the presenter view?
I'm looking at the presented view.
The right one
I'm
or the one with the notes?
I not no notes. Notes were
No
there,
notes.
but
Okay, great.
notes are gone now.
Awesome. Okay,
Mhm.
wonderful. Cool. So today's topic is about neurotechnology to restore and repair the nervous system. And as I mentioned, I'm currently a professor. I'm in neurosurgery, and so I think a lot about how implanted devices or even non-invasive devices can really influence the nervous system. And my background at FDA also gives me a sense of how to develop these technologies and bring them onto the marketplace. And so, I think kind of just to start with some of the fundamental principles of why do we care about neurotechnology? Why should we be concerned about this? We have pharmacological solutions sometimes that can be helpful, but neurotechnology speaks to the nervous system in a different way than drugs do. And that's because the brain, the spinal cord, and all the peripheral nerves, all the nerves in the body, communicate using electrical signals as well as with chemical signals. And so the drugs that we develop can target sort of the chemical system of the brain, but neurotechnology is better able to target the electrical systems of the brain. And so, sometimes when there's injury to the brain, spinal cord, or peripheral nerve, what it does is it blocks these electrical communication signals. So I'm showing you here a little, like a video that's looping of a signal. And this was made by the company Microtransponder and is available on their website. But it's showing how signals can travel up the spinal cord and into the brain in this particular instance. And so when you have an injury, those signals can be blocked. But neurotechnology allows us to add electricity sort of back into the nervous system to help restore or replace some of these lost communication that can happen following an injury. Um, and I do want to point out that these are still early efforts. There are some neurotechnologies that exist on the market. Earlier, right before this call started, we were talking about cochlear implants to help those who are deaf or hearing impaired to regain a sense of hearing. And those have been a long time. Neurostimulation technology has been on the market for a while, but many of the other neuromodulation technologies that I'll talk about are still sort of in the development process. So we're still learning as scientists and engineers and clinicians how to best use these tools to access the nervous system. And so I'm going to focus on two types of stimulation for this call, although there are a bunch of different neurotechnologies out there. But I'm going to start with spinal cord stimulation. And so just a brief definitions: spinal cord stimulation uses electrical stimulation of the spinal cord to promote spinal to brain communication. And this can include a brain-computer interface component, and I'll tell you a little bit more about how that works. And then I'm also going to talk about vagus nerve stimulation, which is electrical stimulation of the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve is the longest nerve in the body, and it travels from connections to the brain and down to nearly all of the internal organs in the body. And so it's a major kind of communication pathway between the inner state of the body and the brain. And so both of these devices have certain things in common. In the process of using these technologies for recovering function, especially motor function, this electrical stimulation is paired with physical rehabilitation. And these devices can either be implanted, so implanted into the spinal cord or onto the vagus nerve, usually in this region of the neck, or there are external stimulating devices as well. And so just to start with spinal cord stimulation, I wanted to give you an example from a company called Onward Medical that is making spinal cord stimulators that they're hoping will be able to restore movement and other functions for patients with spinal cord injury. And I'm picking Onward because they have a technology and they have some really great informational videos about this technology. But I just want to make it clear that they're not the only company that's building this type of devices. And there are also many academic labs, research labs, and engineers who have laid the foundation for this work and continue to work on this. So I just want to make sure everybody knows that it's not just this one group that's doing this, but I will highlight their particular work today.
And I just would like to slip in a mention that Onward and Spinex have both been on the show and talked about their products. As you say, there are many others. But if people want to go back and look at the YouTube channel, Christopher Reeve, Nurse Linda YouTubes, you can view what they have to say as well.
Wonderful. That's great. So I'm glad that you've gotten the chance to hear from Onward. And so I am going to play a couple of short videos from them because they do a really nice job of explaining how this neurotechnology works and what it can mean for patients. And so the first video that I'll share here is from a subject who has a spinal cord stimulator. And this person has a spinal cord injury that prevents him from making voluntary movements with his legs. He's not able to walk. But with the spinal cord stimulator, he can regain some function. So let's just hear it from his mouth, and you can see a little bit. So here is this person being able to take steps and walk up to 1 kilometer with his neurostimulation technology. So this is him. So now they've turned it off, and you can see that ability to walk was disrupted when the stimulation was turned off. So how does it work? The brain sends electrical signals along the spinal cord to our legs, and then if it's injured, people can become paralyzed. So by putting this neurostimulator right over the injury, can actually kind of amplify the ability of the brain to communicate down to the legs. And so this This technology is an
I've been
implanted
working in
technology.
the neuroscience now for a long time, and I know that when you have a spinal cord injury, after a while, if there is no progress, it will remain like this. And so what I noticed for the first time is a change, even in a chronic state. And that's, for me, something completely new.
So here this person is showing,
Well, I always
demonstrating again.
dreamed of walking again, and now this dream is almost there.
I'm surprised over and over again when we really get there, and it's a lot of fun, and it feels very good.
So it's important to note there are still limitations, and these devices
I think you
can't
got
be
to try
used
to do the impossible, to make
all
the
the
possible
time.
possible.
All right. So as you can see, there's enormous promise from these types of technology, but also still remain some limitations. The external devices in particular can be uncomfortable, and they're still really in investigational use. But there's a lot of promise, and Onward and a number of other groups are working extremely hard to make improvements to the technology so that these are even more practical and more usable in a home environment. And then spinal cord stimulation itself can be really valuable, but one other way to kind of increase the ability of spinal cord stimulation to help people is to pair it with a brain-computer interface. So a brain-computer interface is electrodes that are implanted on the brain or into the brain that actually, instead of stimulating the brain like in spinal cord stimulation, where those devices are actually passing electricity into the spinal cord, in a brain-computer interface, those devices are listening to the brain. So they're actually just detecting those little electrical signals that neurons send to one another. They're listening to them and then using computational power, computer programs. Investigators can decode what the neurons are saying to each other and then use that to drive the spinal cord stimulation. So now you have the brain itself telling the stimulator when to turn on and how to drive that stimulation. And so let me show you one little video on how this works. This is again from the here. I'm going to share my screen and move back to here. Okay. And so on this video, again, this is from Onward, and this is this is a demonstration of how a brain-computer interface can actually interact with spinal cord stimulation. So let's watch this one.
An intention to move originates in the brain. The brain-computer interface captures that intention and uses AI to decode the information. The Onward ArcIM platform then converts that decoded information into precise stimulation of the spinal cord, restoring communication between the brain and the body, resulting in thought-driven movement.
Yeah, all right. So as you can see, you can combine these neurotechnologies. You can combine a brain-computer interface with spinal cord stimulation to make a system that's really personalized to every patient who is implanted with this system, because it's listening to that person's movement-related brain signals and then conveying that information to the person's spinal cord. And so that can make this technology even more powerful than spinal cord stimulation alone.
So now,
and
if you created this device, and there are good examples of walking, which notably is not the same as it was before the disease or injury, but still walking.
Sure.
And what about other functions like bowel, bladder, sexual function,
Yeah.
breathing, cardiac, all those kinds of things?
Yeah, absolutely. So those there have been some studies demonstrating that spinal cord stimulation can absolutely help enable that kind of communication between brain and body as well. Because again, even though we think of those as body functions, there are neural control pathways between our brain and our body that control all of those different functions. And so spinal cord stimulation itself can definitely help to improve the control of those types of functions. There are also stimulators that can be placed instead of on the spinal cord, they can be placed on the nerves that, say, for instance, control voiding of the bladder as an example. And that can allow for maybe more precise control of a specific function like bladder function. So there's different approaches that are being explored to see what's the best way to use neurotechnology to interact with each of these systems. And there's very exciting work going on this, not only with this Swiss group that we talked about, but also at Case Western Reserve University, University of Michigan, and a variety of different research centers across the country.
And I see we have a question that just popped in about levels of pain when walking. They're asking about some medications and would there be pain with people who have when they first start walking? But and I'm going to have our information specialist put in the hierarchy of pain treatments. There's a booklet that the Reeve Foundation has so that they will have that. But I guess in this question, it's the difference between mobility issues and sensation issues. So do they play together? Does it improve sensation? Because usually people who just use the stimulator for walking, they don't really have pain because they don't have sensation. So they're able to do more stimulation. So what about merging the two of those, sensation and mobility?
Yeah, right. Well, I think that one thing that's important to note is that, of course, every patient's level of motor versus sensory deficit is a little different. And so, as you mentioned, some patients may not have sensation at all, and so then there would be no pain associated with it. When the subject in the video mentioned that the implant could be uncomfortable, that person does have sensory sensation remaining. And I think with regards to pain, I'm sorry, sometimes I hear some feedback. Does anyone else hear that, or is it okay from everybody else's end?
I'm not hearing.
Okay, great, good. So with regards to pain, there are some really interesting neurotechnologies that are being explored to see how they can control or help to mitigate pain. And actually, one of those is a different type of neurostimulation technology called vagus nerve stimulation. And while vagus nerve stimulation is explored, has been explored for motor recovery in patients who have experienced motor impairment after stroke, and in smaller studies in those with spinal cord injury. There is actually promise that vagus nerve stimulation may also be able to interact with the pain centers in the brain and try to and help to ameliorate some of the brain-related pain sensation, right? Because some of our pain sensation comes from the periphery, from maybe peripheral nerves that are not firing appropriately, misfiring, but some pain sensation actually comes from what's called like central sensitization. So the brain itself can kind of represent pain in ways that are not appropriate. And so vagus nerve stimulation may be able to address some of that. Yeah, but maybe I can tell you just a little bit about how vagus nerve stimulation is being used to treat patients with stroke very briefly, and a little bit about what my lab has done from a preclinical side. So it's sort of a not in human subjects, but in animal models to try to understand how vagus nerve stimulation can interact with motor systems. So I'll move back here. slides. And so this is a screenshot from a company called Microtransponder, and I was playing their video earlier. But the technology that they've developed is actually implanting an electrical stimulator here in the neck region on the vagus nerve. And the vagus nerve both sends input up into the brain and down into the body. But in this case, it seems like the input up into the brain is sort of the most important part of this therapy. And the way that this therapy works is that a patient who has an upper extremity impairment, they would receive a pulse of stimulation on their vagus nerve every time that they're engaged in a physical rehabilitation activity. So they're working with a PT, they're doing exercises that are designed for them by the PT, but they would receive a pulse of vagus nerve stimulation each time they do an exercise. And the reason for this is that vagus nerve stimulation is thought to drive plasticity in the brain. So basically, it allows the brain to learn new things more quickly and better, to a higher level of efficiency than the brain would be able to do without the vagus nerve stimulation. And so instead of just serving to enhance communication, like the spinal cord stimulator, the vagus nerve stimulation seems to play a slightly different role in terms of driving plasticity and sort of helping the nervous system, the brain, recover to a sense on its own, or kind of use those own mechanisms of plasticity for recovery. And so my lab is really interested in understanding how vagus nerve stimulation can drive plasticity. And we sort of set out to explore a hypothesis. And so our hypothesis is that electrical stimulation of the vagus nerve, shown here, leads to activation of centers in the brain that are called neuromodulatory centers. And neuromodulators are really potent chemicals. You've probably heard of some of these, like dopamine and serotonin and acetylcholine and norepinephrine. And these are chemicals that are released into the brain and can kind of help drive the way that the brain is functioning at any given point in time. And so it's known that vagus nerve stimulation may activate these centers. And so we wanted to explore specifically if it could activate the basal forebrain, which is the cholinergic center for acetylcholine, because cholinergic signaling is really important for plasticity in motor cortex. And so we wanted to know if, when we stimulate the vagus nerve, does it in fact drive activity in cholinergic regions? And does that lead to plasticity in the motor part of the brain? And so our question was sort of formulated like this: when you stimulate the vagus nerve, and we're working in animal models, so in a mouse, and we teach the mouse to do a sort of hard thing for them to do, which is to grab a very small food pellet from a very specific location. Can we make them better at learning this hard thing if we stimulate the vagus nerve just as they're learning to do this? And if so, what are the brain regions involved? And so we know that the vagus nerve, it terminates in the brainstem in a region called the NTS, or the nucleus of the solitary tract. But then how does that relate to motor control, or the motor regions of the brain, to make an animal better at learning a motor skill? And so we did, because we're working with mice, we can use some interesting tools that are not available in other types of investigation. So we can use genetic tools that actually allow us to express some proteins in a small population of neurons in the mouse's brain that let us manipulate the firing, the electrical signals coming out of just those really small group of neurons. It's a technique called optogenetics. And we can manipulate the firing of those neurons by passing light into the brain. And so we implant a little tiny light delivery fiber into the brain of these animals, and we can control how their neurons fire. So if each of these dots is an electrical signal from a neuron, when we shine the light on, we get a lot more dots. Those neurons are really firing right when we do that. And so by doing this, we can then look at how well these animals can learn to grab that food pellet over 14 days of training. In gray is our control animals, and in orange are the animals that receive vagus nerve stimulation. And so you can see vagus nerve stimulation makes these animals better at learning this task. But then what happens if we go and manipulate those cholinergic neurons so that the cholinergic neurons can't fire anymore? When we do that, the animals get worse. And so what that tells us is that it's really important that cholinergic neuromodulation is really important for the plasticity driving effects in the brain. So because we're using animal models, we can really delve into how does the brain work and how does vagus nerve stimulation drive plasticity. We can also do cool things like actually image the neurons in the brain and look at their firing when the vagus nerve is active. And that can tell us a lot about how the vagus nerve stimulation can drive activity in motor cortex. And what it led us to find out is that stimulating the vagus nerve activates the nucleus of the solitary tract, which activates the cholinergic basal forebrain, which then changes the way that motor cortex is processing signals. It shapes the outcome response in motor cortex and lets the animal learn this task better. So that's just kind of a highlight of some of the work that we do on the back end, sort of before clinical trials or while clinical trials are ongoing, to help us better understand how these technologies actually interact with the nervous system. And then that can help us to inform how can we make them better? How can we more effectively modulate cholinergic systems, for instance, to get enhanced plasticity? So I'll stop sharing there and pause for any questions.
Well, that's very interesting how important the chemicals of the brain are, and understanding this kind of research, because there's so much minutia in how the brain and the nervous system works. It's just an incredible process. So some of the questions are exactly, you talked a lot about spinal cord injury, you mentioned stroke, brain injury. So who would be eligible? Now I know you're doing this in the research lab. So how would this apply to people with neurological disease? Is it people with all kinds of neurological injury, disease? People with disease have different levels of sensation. I know we have somebody who wrote in and they had transverse myelitis, so they do have some communication of the nerves, like an incomplete spinal cord injury patient. So do you differentiate with your experiments, or is this just for everyone, for all people?
Yeah, that's such an important point. And I think that what is important to recognize is that when a medical device is approved by the FDA, so when it's actually given that approval to be like implanted or distributed to people who need it, usually the FDA makes that determination based on one pretty specific, it's called indication, so one pretty specific disease. And so right now, spinal cord stimulation is being studied in the context of spinal cord injury, so in patients who have a spinal cord injury. And so probably the first group of people who would have access to that technology when it finally all the tests are completed and it makes its way through the FDA regulatory process and is approved, it would probably be available to patients with spinal cord injury first. But then often what companies will do is once they sort of have approval for one indication, then they'll turn their attention to another similar indication, patients who have similar kinds of deficits, and they'll start running those trials to make sure that the technology is still safe and effective for patients with this other condition. And so usually it's a little bit sequential. And so they'll sort of focus on one group of patients at a time, because, as I know, like different conditions can have different types of risks or different types of side effects. And so it's really important that everyone deeply understands the safety profile and the efficacy, the effectiveness profile for any given condition. So it's probably not going to, these technologies will not be for everyone immediately, but I think that in the future, there holds a huge amount of promise for, especially as we do more research in the lab and understand more about how these technologies work, for this technology to be more broadly applied to the people who can really benefit from it.
And then we have another question. It's a philosophical question a bit here about the balance between research and cure and living with spinal cord injury, which the Reeve Foundation is all about, because we have the research side and we have the quality of life side. So we try to provide that balance. But in your work, have you, and I'm sure you've thought about a lot of this research, like in the videos, the emphasis is on walking, and people with spinal cord injury, that's often not their end game. That's often not their main desire. Bowel, bladder, and
Yeah,
sexual function is much more
right.
feeding yourself, breathing up without the ventilator, all those things. So I'm sure you can talk about devices that have been created for all these different individual type of activities.
Yeah, yeah, this is a great point, because while walking and mobility is an exciting function to target, it is not always or often rated as like the top concern for patients living with spinal cord injury, and so I know that, for instance, Onward is thinking about ways to sort of leverage their technology to address other concerns. But I also want to bring up another device that's in clinical investigation, and this is out of Case Western Reserve University, and this is called the networked neuroprosthesis. And so instead of just targeting the spinal cord for electrical stimulation, this technology targets specific nerves that control specific functions. So they could be those that are controlling bowel or bladder, or muscles, different muscles for movement, or a number of other different conditions. And the way that this device is being developed is sort of in a personalized way, so that patients could identify what are their top concerns, their top medical needs. And then in the ideal scenario, this device could be sort of configured to meet that person's individual needs by implanting different electrodes in different locations that sort of all feed to a central controller that's implanted as well. And so I think there is a lot of consideration towards how do we build technology that's not just looking at movement, but is also addressing the multitude of needs that are out there, and thinking about what each person as a user of technology might value the most and might want the most. And so, as I mentioned, this is not a device that's on the market yet. Much the same as the Onward device, but it is something that is, in development and in clinical trials at this point.
Well, I'm happy you brought that up, because in 2 months at our next webinar, they're going to be on the webinar.
Oh,
So,
great!
yeah,
Wonderful.
the Case Western people. So thank you for that. That was very helpful.
Good. Yeah.
Okay, now this question is for me, and it's about the autonomic nervous systems, which controls so many things. It controls our breathing, it controls our heart beating, it controls our response to infection, and it's so many things that we don't think about. We think about movement, we think about sensation, but there are all these things going on inside the body that just happens
Right.
automatically. And so, a lot of our patients, they do everything right and they follow their bladder program to the letter, and yet they have all kinds of urinary tract infections. And other
Mm.
people don't really pay so much attention to that, and they have no urinary tract
Yeah.
infections. Some people have a lot of respiratory problems where other people don't. During the COVID, we were very concerned about respiratory problems, which turned out to be not a thing for people with spinal cord issues. Which was kind of odd because, we
Yeah.
thought, uh-oh, that was headed that way. And then it turned out it was, so we learned a lot, but it all has to do with the autonomic nervous system. So things like
Yeah.
the vagus nerve, which you explained so aptly, would being able to control that, would that help these things that are kind of non-tangible autonomic nervous
Yeah.
system? What do you see the advancements going in that field?
Yeah, there's a huge amount of research going on into the autonomic nervous system, autonomic control, and a lot of it involves vagus nerve stimulation and modulation. And it's a really great point that you brought up, because the little diagram that I showed before, that little video I was looping, shows sort of the input from the vagus nerve up into the brain, which is what my lab has studied. But obviously, there's a huge amount of control that's going down from the brain via the vagus nerve to all of the internal organs. And so there's a lot of promising research on sort of that direction, so to speak, of control. And so, for instance, vagus nerve stimulation is being investigated for the control of inflammation. And it's being investigated both for acute inflammatory response and also chronic. And one of the studies that's the furthest along is Setpoint Medical is in, I believe, phase 3 studies for vagus nerve stimulation for rheumatoid arthritis. And so they've gotten some really interesting early results showing that vagus nerve stimulation can sort of tamp down that immune mediated inflammation, that inflammatory response, and make patients feel much, much better. Another thing that's interesting, and this is something we're also looking at in the lab, is that you don't have to implant a device in the cervical region of the neck to access the vagus nerve. There's actually vagal afferents in the ear, sort of like right underneath where my earbud is right now. And it's possible to put a non-invasive stimulator in the ear and electrically stimulate those vagal afferents, those vagal nerve fibers that exist in the ear. And there's an FDA-approved device to treat opioid use withdrawal, which is really sounds a little bit unconnected to anything else that we're talking about. But when someone goes into withdrawal, they have a huge sympathetic response. So there's your heart is racing, you're sweating, your breathing is very, very fast. And so what this company, Spark Biomedical, has shown is that by electrically stimulating the vagal afferents in the ear, they can help people who are going through withdrawal. They can activate the parasympathetic response. And so there is a decrease in the respiration rate, the heart rate goes down, the withdrawal symptoms are alleviated for many people, just showing that you can actually activate those parasympathetic autonomic properties, even just by non-invasive stimulation in the ear. And so this sort of non-invasive approach holds a lot of promise as well. And I know that Spark Biomedical is now looking at this in the context of blood loss and controlling blood loss. And there are some interesting results that they're exploring there. But I think the possibilities are enormous for how it might be possible to access the autonomic system, the parasympathetic system, even with a non-invasive technology.
And more and more companies are coming up, like Onward, and these other companies are, they started out with surface electrodes, and then they moved to implants, and now they're back to surface electrodes again. So it's just amazing how people are not only looking at improving lives of people with neurological issues, but they're also thinking about those non-invasive kinds of things, which
Yeah.
brings up a question that somebody wrote in. Are there ways to stimulate the vagus nerve by hand?
Mm. Um, well, the vagus nerve is it's sort of buried deep within the body for the most part. Again, it interacts with your internal organs. So the probably the part of the vagus nerve that's most accessible is actually the one in the ear. And I'm not sure if sort of like rubbing your ear can stimulate the vagus nerve. I don't think anyone knows that at this point. But I will say that a really well-validated way to activate the vagus nerve is through deep breathing. And the reason for that is because the vagus nerve heavily interacts with the lungs. And specifically, these cells called pump cells that detect when you have inspired, when you have a deep inspiration. So when your lungs are full of air, these pump cells will activate and they send their information to the vagus nerve. So that's part of the vagus nerve system. And so actually deep breathing exercises or box breathing can directly activate vagal fibers and sort of elicit some of those parasympathetic responses. So it's not by hand, but it is something that's possible to control. And has a lot of scientific evidence to demonstrate that you are in fact able to control your vagal activity through these types of deep breathing.
So that is out of the box kind of thinking, but very simple kinds of thinking. So if we can, and there's a couple of people that have written in that they have tried some of that, some different breathing exercises and that sort
Yeah,
of thing.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
so there's some people who've written in and they're like, how do I get involved with these studies? And I know
Yeah.
you're on the bench side and they're talking, but
Mhm.
that, there are clinical studies going on. So what's your thoughts on how people can become engaged?
Yeah. So one thing I want to end with is to kind of circle back to the IBCI collaborative community that we mentioned at the beginning. And just to remind everyone, this is a group that is established by one of the leading investigators in brain-computer interface technology, Lee Hochberg, and one of the leading advocates and experts in neurotechnology, and also a user of implanted neurostimulation, Jen French, who runs the Neurotech Network. And Lee and Jen established the IBCICC specifically to create a way so that everyone can come together and talk about how we should all move forward with neurotechnology. And so I have just one more slide to share. And I'm going to go back here and just share, that community engagement and sort of bringing together of all of the different stakeholders in the community, including users of technology, is extremely important for accomplishing the goals for our technology. And so the IBCICC, which is led by Lee and Jen and others, it creates a forum for this. And these are the kinds of questions that the IBCICC is going to tackle in their working groups. And one thing that we would really, really love from people who are part of the Reeve Foundation community is for those who have interest and experience with spinal cord injury to reach out and to consider even being a part of the working groups to provide user perspective, patient perspective, to help answer some of these really important questions. Like what are the right things to measure when you're running a clinical trial for spinal cord stimulators or BCI technology? What are the right clinicians who should be in the room for this? What happens if a company provides implanted devices to patients and then goes out of business? Like, what are the kind of protections that need to be put in place to ensure that everyone who receives technology is safe and taken care of? So there's a lot of different types of questions that the IBCICC is looking for input on. So I am a member of the Christopher and Dana Reeve Foundation Scientific Advisory Board, and I'm our primary liaison for the IBCICC. But we're really interested in having more liaisons from the Reeve Foundation. We'd really love to get people from a variety of different perspectives. And I'm hoping that maybe I can actually bring some of the IBCICC people back here to this webinar to explain a little bit further, a little bit more about the mission, and talk about ways that everyone can get involved in this really unique group. Yeah, so hopefully that is helpful. You know, in terms of clinical trials, I do believe that there's information on sort of existing clinical trials that the Reeve Foundation provides. And if not the Reeve Foundation, certainly NIH and others have some really great resources on all of the ongoing trials that I'd be happy to provide links to afterwards.
We have a couple of links in the chat box there for those trials. And just your thoughts on if somebody has an FES device, somebody wrote in and they said TENS warns against vagal stimulation on the ears. So your thoughts about using one device and trying it on something else?
Yeah, yeah,
Careful.
right. Yeah, exactly. I mean, TENS devices are designed to stimulate, you know, really big areas. Like typically they're used with electrodes that are put on the muscles, like on the legs or the arms, and so they have these really big electrodes. And so the safety hardware that was built into that technology is designed for use with these sort of relatively specific types of stimulation electrodes. And obviously the ear is much smaller, so you might end up applying too much current to the ear, which could be painful and could potentially lead to things like skin burns or irritation. And so there are some risks involved when you're trying to sort of convert one technology and use it for a different use. And what I would say is that I think there's going to be some really interesting ear-based stimulation technologies coming onto the market in various ways, you know, sometime in the near future. So it might be better to sort of to wait and keep an eye on the technology space for devices that have really been designed with safety in mind to safely stimulate the ear or other regions.
And here's a big question, as we don't have much time left, but here's a really big question about, is there any of this that's going to be addressing with genetic engineering?
Yeah, that's super interesting, right? So I talked a little bit about genetic engineering with the mice, right? It's pretty easy, relatively easy and well established to do in mice. But gene therapy is absolutely on the horizon for human use as well. And there have been some really interesting trials, for instance, in the use of gene therapy in the eye for patients who have experienced specific forms of blindness, and kind of helping them to recover some vision. And then of course there are other ways to sort of access gene therapy in the immune modulation space. So it's definitely something that is under development, and I think the big questions there are around safety. How do you safely give this to people and make sure that you can kind of predict the outcome in a way that's reasonable? And so yeah, huge amount of interest and investment in that space. And I definitely think that we'll see some additional gene therapy technologies coming onto the market. But it takes, just like everything, it certainly takes a lot of time to make sure that it's done in a way that's safe and that the FDA will allow it to move forward.
So we're coming to the close of the time, but what would your 3 take-home points to our listeners be? If we've covered everything so
So many
broadly,
things.
what
Yeah.
are the 3 things that our listeners really need to know about?
Well, I think I'd love everyone to remember that electrical signaling is a really important part of the nervous system, and injuries can block those electrical signals. And so that's why neurotechnology is so special, because you can replace some of that electrical communication with a device. And the other cool thing is that you can make it specific to a patient. So depending on their injury, where the injury is, you can tailor that electrical stimulation to meet a patient's individual needs, which is something unique about neurotechnology. And then finally, I would say that these innovations take time to develop, but they also really require input from everyone who's involved in the process. And so, if there are people out there who would love to be involved in kind of giving feedback on the development of neurotechnology, I think places like the IBCICC are a great way to get involved in that.
And that link is in the chat box there. So anybody who's interested, I think it is just fabulous that we see this tandem of the bench research and the clinical research working and meshing so well together. In years past, researchers didn't always communicate with each other. Everything was very private and consolidated, just in my space. And I love the fact that you've got this whole consortium that's going to connect this, and especially that you're including individuals who are living with these situations, because
Yeah.
oftentimes as clinicians or researchers, we don't always see the things that are happening in their lives, and they're so real and sharing that with us. So that is just wonderful. We wish you much success
Yeah,
with
thank
the
you. Exciting.
IBCI and with your career. And we hope that we can hear from you again at some point later on, and hear about all the wonderful things that you have been included in your advancements. And so this has just been a wonderful seminar today. And I thank you very much for participating.
No, thank you. It's really been my pleasure. I've been really enjoyed this conversation.
Well, thank you. It's been just wonderful. I can't believe the hour has gone by so quickly for me. I hope for everyone else
That's
as
right.
well. But wow, what a lot of information. Well, I'll have to
Yeah.
go back and listen to this over and over again to pick up all the information we need to know. So thank you once again for your participation.
Absolutely. Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you.